Hi, everyone. Today we are doing a panel discussion on how to prepare for Madrid Worlds. With me, I have got a couple of amazing panelists who we're going to ask some questions to. The first is Josef Moscovici, who is very qualified, has been an open quarter finalist of Belgrade Worlds, an ESL grand finalist of both Thailand Worlds and Madrid Euros, and is a DCA for the upcoming Black Sea Euros. As well, we have Umar Buckus, who is a DCA both past and present for PAUDC, has also been a DCA of Doxbridge Worlds, an ESL Final judge of Korea Worlds, and an Open Final judge of ABP. And importantly, both of these individuals, like myself, have been to or experienced both an in-person and online worlds at the very minimum. So I guess we'll have those insights to share and hopefully be able to help people who are perhaps attending an in-person worlds where they have not attended worlds before or have not attended maybe an in-person worlds before. So thank you very much for both joining me here today. I really much appreciate your time. So I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions, nothing too fancy or too stressful, hopefully. I'm going to start with you, Yossi, and then we might change it up. But the first is just that many people are obviously, as alluded to, going to be coming to their first ever in-person worlds. So other than the very obvious stuff about, you know, you're there in person, you have to wake up, you have to get to a venue. What in your mind are the major sort of key differences, and I guess things that people might not think of so much, and how in your mind can participants best prepare for these differences?
So I think one of the key differences that I perceive, at least, between online and offline debating is primarily how noisy and cramped actual in-person debating is. As in, when you're in a room, sometimes those rooms may or may not have full capacity tables and chairs. Sometimes, you know, the way the debating itself takes place may not be exactly to your comfort because you can't control exactly the space that you're going to be debating in the same way that you do when you're at home, right? When you're at home, you have your desk, you have your, you have your setup, you know exactly how everything is. You don't hear other people talking to each other because, you know, their mics are off, etc. So there is a lot of noise. There's a lot of surrounding distracting factors that I think a lot of people who may not have yet done in-person debating before might not be accustomed to, might not be used for, and that to them might be particularly distracting because they lack the experience of dealing with that. One of the ways I usually found to be quite effective at dealing with it was to just talk about it, to ask, ideally between speakers, like between people speaking. You can raise a point of order with the chair and you can say, look, I know people want to talk and I get it, I do too, but just given the circumstances, I just can't focus like this. And usually people, in most instances, will be good about this. I think most of us aren't, you know, like aren't trying to be mean or aren't trying to be distracting to each other. And so most of us will stop, especially when someone asks in particular. I mean, obviously, if it becomes a significant issue, you can always also talk to equity to perhaps ask for, you know, rooms that maybe have better acoustics or settings, etc. If you really need an accessibility room, like if you have neurodiversity and just can't deal with those kinds of environments, then I'm sure that you can also talk to equity and they'll try and help you out with that. So these would be some of the ways I would deal with that.
Yeah, for sure. And I would sort of just add to that we have a fabulous equity team, obviously, who I'm sure if people have particular sort of access needs can definitely reach out to them. What about you, Umar? What do you think about the key differences?
Yeah, I think so sort of similar along the line of like just that you don't necessarily have access, like you don't online to like, you know, your comfortable spaces and just like, you know, spaces to switch off, just like getting used to the fact that or sort of thinking about how you're going to deal with these things proactively. This made a really big difference for me, like now coming back to in-person debating. So literally just like having understandings with our partners in terms of like, after rounds, how would we like to, how would like to deal with it? Do you want to go for a walk, just listen to some music, sort of exit the space and find somewhere where you can be a bit more comfortable for a few minutes. These sort of like thoughts proactively are really important, because it means that like when you go to a in-person major, which is generally quite a long period of time, you don't sort of like knock on or kick the can of exhaustion down the line, and so it becomes a bit more survivable. So yeah, I think finding and also just asking for support. So like equity teams are often like I think underutilized in terms of like very reasonable concerns, like I need some space, I need some I need a little bit of assistance in this way, and like just being really proactive and like, hey, if you could just talk about this, or how do you think you could guide me on this, and like Josef spoke about like asking the chair to be a bit more like active in terms of making sure that you feel comfortable in the room. So for instance, I think we sort of established the precedent of like online, people illustrate their preference and people abide by that, which I think before online wasn't so set in stone. And I think a lot of people now feel quite unhappy with like, sort of very like loud verbal POIs, and it does take them off their flow. And so specifying things like that, I think people still generally, if you do specify, they're more than happy to accommodate, but just, making sure that you can proactively just voice the things that you need. Because as a new debater coming to these spaces, it's a bit overwhelming just because it's like, people you've never met, people you have, people who, you might look up to. So it's really difficult to say, I need help, and just asking for that hand, I think is the main thing that my suggestion is.
Yeah, totally. And I think that also extends to like just your friends and surroundings, right? Because unlike online where you can just after a round switch off and go lie down on your couch and tune everything out, you don't really have the capacity to do that at Worlds. So if you do need a moment of space to like go for a walk, just tell your friends that, and I'm sure they'll be pretty understanding. But it's just about like recognizing your own needs and not like letting it build up and simmer until a particularly uncomfortable point, which actually leads me to my next question, which I had a little bit later, but I'm just going to pop up now, which is just about stress management in general. So obviously this advice probably applies to both in-person on and online worlds, but maybe particularly useful for in-person worlds, again, when you're like surrounded by people. What are your, and I might start with Umar here, what are your kind of best stress management strategies, whether it's dealing with silent rounds, the break announcement, generally interacting with people, all of that? Would love your tips.
Yeah. So I think debating is really quite important to us. So I think like it's inevitable when you spend this amount of time in a sport that you obviously associate a lot with your performance and like your perceived like ability to engage in spaces, get first, and like even in close rounds, you generally you're able to surmise how you're doing. And so dealing with that stress is like really important in terms of surviving the last few days of comps. And so the way that I've sort of dealt with it is just that establishing and making sure that you have like a lot of support groups, like a lot of like channels of support. So your debating partner, of people in your society, but also like I always try to do my best to speak to my family and like let them know that I'm going to be like, it's going to be a tough couple of days. I might not be able to reach out as much, but if you can just check in on me once in a while, those sort of like support networks I think are really vital to making sure that again, you can probably get through it exhausted, right? But you probably want to be in the best position, just making sure that you have those things. And also just like really silly things like making sure you get rest over like, partying. I think like sometimes the obligations, like, we want to go out and stuff, but like I cannot stress how much like just taking a night off once in a while, having a quiet dinner with some friends, and then getting some rest can be like incredibly important. Just letting your ability to like let go of anything that's happened that day. And again, I cannot stress also using equity when you feel as if like you're in situations where you can't handle it, and asking for help, especially because Worlds has a lot of different people from different spaces, and sometimes unintentionally you might get acted upon by in a number of different ways, and just making sure that you know and access things that are there to support you. And I think this is also like these people are like they're there specifically, and their creation, like they're literally meant to be there to give you that help. And so again, just reach out to them when you can.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the family note is very important because, however, there are so many times where I feel like I should be more responsive to my mum and my family, but I'm sure they understand that, yeah, it is a stressful time. Yossi, what about you? Do you have any other thoughts on that?
So I think a lot of the things that Umar said, I also strongly agree with, especially I think the drinking and partying in general, I think is a big one. At least my partner and I, because we knew how stressful Worlds would be, we would have a rule of we're not drinking more than 2 units of alcohol any day before we have rounds, and we at the latest at midnight we're in bed. Like these types of rules, these types of just making sure that on top of the emotional stress that Worlds represents, you don't also add just all of the physical strain of just being out every day and without sleep, and your liver working overtime to detoxify. And so I think I definitely strongly agree with that. But I think on top of that, I feel that a lot of people, and this is kind of true in online debating as well, but I guess it's less possible because you're more separate. But when you're surrounded by hundreds, if not thousands of debaters, there is a very distinct chance that many of them will be talking about debate. And frankly, sometimes at least I would get sick of it. I had a terrible day one, and I know I have to make it up in the next 2 days. And now I hear all these people talking about cases. And I'm like, come on, I just can't deal with this. I don't want to hear any of you speaking. And I think to just accept that it's perfectly legitimate to want space for yourself, and to that you don't owe anyone being social, and you don't owe anyone talking about debate, and then that it's okay for you to say, I'd rather not talk about this. It's fine if you want to talk about this, but then, let's talk to other people. And being cognizant of this, and being cognizant of the fact that it's okay for you to do that, I think is one of the bigger things I learned over my time in debating, that I don't have to all the time, that this now has to be my life for the next 7 days, regardless of how I feel in the moment. And I think that's probably a big one for me in terms of dealing with stress.
Yeah, 100%. I definitely agree with all of that. Like, proper nutrition and hydration, so important. Getting enough sleep, so important. And setting boundaries. Like, if everyone is talking about the back tab and you don't want to know, then make it clear that that is your boundary. I think that's so important. I might also just, I kind of want to share one anecdote here, which is kind of just to, I think people also, and just my 2 cents here is that you always will care about your own results more than anyone else will, and you're always scrutinizing your own results more than anyone else will. Like, a little known fact about me is that my world's performance trajectory a very long time ago, I'm just going to out myself here, was Worlds 2012 came so close to the break, did not break. Worlds 2013 broke, progressed through to quarters. Worlds 2014 did not break. You can imagine how devastating it was for me. And I was literally thinking, everyone's going to think my previous break was a fluke. Everyone's going to think I didn't deserve that. It's going to undermine all my future success. Like, I'd like to think no one fucking cares about like my, what my break or not break was like all that time ago, so yeah, I think it's like a good reminder that, like, people obviously, there'll be some discussion about it, but it probably is not going to like actually inform how everyone perceives you, and if you're a good debater, people will know you're a good debater, so ought not stress too much. But that actually, so I want to now sort of move this discussion to the more, I guess, debatery aspects of Worlds. And that is about preparation for Worlds. Now, obviously, everyone's going to have their own approach. Some people are going to be sparring every day. Others are going to focus on comps. Others are going to focus on matter prep. Keeping in mind, there's obviously no one right method, and it will be very individualistic. What are your thoughts on how the ideal kind of prep season should go in terms of balancing different priorities? Or any kind of tips that you might have? Again, might start with Yossi here first, if you can.
So I think there is a tendency of debaters to not understand that practice is practice, and for them to overemphasize that I must win every round or else I am terrible as a human being for some reason. And I think this is a bad approach for 2 reasons. One, because it's obviously draining to feel that way and think that way, but like from a less, from a more cynical and only debate matters perspective, it's also just ineffective, because you have now, a month and a half, maybe 2 if we're generous, to get ready for Worlds left. And there are maybe 2 or 3 things in that time that you can maybe improve on, probably more realistically, 1 that you want to really focus on. And I think identifying where you currently have the biggest need of improvement, as in identifying that one thing, be it you're not impacting your points, so they often lose just because judges don't understand, then your job for the next month and a half, in every practice tournament, in every practice round, in every drill, no matter what you do, your goal should be to do nothing, if nothing else, make sure you're impacting. I'm picking impacting arbitrarily. Any other aspect of debating where you're currently struggling with the most, where you consistently hear feedback from judges at tournaments, at practice rounds, I don't know, where that's the feedback you keep hearing, probably that's where you can do the most work and just focus on that. And I would do that, by the way, at the expense of other things, by which I mean you're practicing impacting. Okay, so you're going to drop 3 mechanisms out of your 7 mechanisms that you always run, and you're going to just focus instead on doing impacting. And until you hear from judges, and I recommend that whether or not you're drilling or like personally drilling or doing it in practices or doing it in tournaments, ask specifically for feedback on that. Or if you're listening to your own speeches, listen specifically and give yourself feedback on that and emphasize the specific element you're working on. Because I think blindly doing more and more and more rounds, it's good, it's helpful, but it's not as effective as if you're working on the thing that's actually the problem and fixing that. And I think given how little time there's left, relatively speaking, I would strongly recommend going by this focused approach.
Excellent, excellent advice. Umar, what do you think?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of what was just said about like targeted training and stuff. And I think a bit like sort of an easy way to get to stuff that you need to improve is just trying to use maybe a document that like just tracks your performances, and just where you're able to like centralize and record feedback so that you can focus and fine tune the things that you need to do. I think you'll start to notice over time, especially if you debate a lot, that judges keep flagging 1 or 2 things that probably like maybe more than not like just come up, and flagging and like noting those things in a place where you've got the access to, okay, cool, maybe this impacting thing is the thing that I need to train on. Just again, because like it is very difficult to improve holistically as a debater, like after you've gotten to a certain level, and you do have to be a bit more targeted in terms of where you spend your time. And like I think a good way to look through this is just like there are a number of like speech trackers that like are available online. I know the Manchester people put one out with their training documents. You can probably get it there. But also just note that like the other thing that I think debaters sometimes are not as cognizant of, just in terms of prep season, is prep in a way that doesn't mean that you get to Worlds burnt out, right? So you can debate a lot, you can do a lot of spars and stuff, but make sure you're not like you're not pushing yourself too far. And I think especially competitive debaters oftentimes, like if you get to Worlds for your university, you're probably it's probably at the culmination of many years of work, and there's an incredible amount of stress, and just making sure that you get there in a headspace where you are not exhausted because you've been traveling the last 5 weekends for tournaments, or you've been staying up to prep in other time zones to see scope the competition on the other side of the world. Just be cognizant of like what are your boundaries in terms of hitting a point where you're burnt out, and making sure that you get to Worlds at a level point so you can engage the competition with your best foot forward. I think a lot of debaters don't do this, and just trying to just be cognizant, okay, maybe I'm going a bit too far. And also the best thing to do this, in my opinion, is having a very honest relationship with your partner, your debating partner, like, hey, maybe we're doing too much, but we can maybe turn it back a bit. I need some rest, these things. I think that's the best way to prep.
Yeah, I definitely echo the burnout thing, because I think like Worlds is not just Worlds, but it's like the entire experience leading up to Worlds that you'll also remember and kind of group together. And if like 90% of it ends up being bad because, you've again burnt yourself out, then you'll probably group everything together and look back on it not particularly fondly. Also sort of echoing something that Yossi said before about, performance and stuff, like you probably, pick up the advice you can from spars and whatnot, but remember that they're not exactly a perfect replica of like the competitive energy you'll feel in person. So don't read into it too much. I also know so many teams that have had like not the best prep performance, e.g. they've maybe not done as well at prep comps, but then they've smashed it at Worlds. So just like I totally agree with the sentiment of not like reading into it too much while still taking away what constructive feedback you can. So I guess on this note, something kind of I want to touch on is I guess how to say it. Like a lot of people have this perception that I guess we'll say older / colloquially boomer judges have different judging preferences. So for example, I think a lot of people have the idea that like a lot of older judges don't like the current meta, which like may or may not involve dumping a lot of mechanisms. And given there's going to be, I guess, a lot of judges coming back to Madrid that may have not actually been as prolific in the, we'll call it online era, I guess there's no right or wrong to this, is kind of just your opinion, I guess. But I wanted to ask whether you think there's any truth to this view about different, I guess, judging styles. And if so, I guess what would be your advice to a debater that might encounter these different judges? Should you adapt your style or kind of just do what works for you? So who did I go first the last time? I think it was you. So Umar, I will start with you.
Yeah, I think I maybe have a bit of a I'm not sure if it's like the popular opinion on this, but I think, like, to be honest with you, I generally I will adjust, like, how I pitch my speeches according to like the way in which the round goes and like the judges who judge me, right? So like I'm generally, when you're prepping for, you probably come across a number of judges, you probably understand through feedback what they value, and so I'll be honest with you, I probably do pitch a little bit different according to who's judging me. And I think the standardization of judging has been really, really strong over the last few years. And I've also recently gone to comps where very prolific debaters from a few years ago have judged me, and like they've given me higher speaks, so either significantly higher or significantly lower than I normally get. And I've just realized that, as someone who's not the most technical debater, I do think that like your job as a debater, regardless of your personal style, is to create cases that are intuitive and that are persuasive, right? So I think you can do this for everyone, and I think leaning into one style, like overly relying on the meta, is probably not the greatest strategy for Worlds, given that the judging variance is quite high in terms of like experience and current knowledge on these things. So I do believe to a certain extent you have to pitch your cases to the judge, and on the basis of that, you adjust what how many mechanisms you might deliver, or rather than like reliance on intuition pumps and stuff like that are relatively prevalent in the last few years. That's where my sort of stance is on it.
Fair. What about you, Josie?
So I think I have I agree with what Umar is saying, but I think I have an additional nuance, I guess, to add, because this idea of a different meta of debating isn't really all that new. It's not like, I know now we separate it by old and new, but I actually think that's incorrect, because for as long as I can remember, which is unfortunately way longer than anyone should, but there are clear, distinct meta preferences also just by region, right? Like I remember Aussie judges really, or I don't know if it's still true. I don't want to lump you all in together, Jess, but like there is this idea that Aussie judges tend to really prioritize how well arguments are mechanized, and then there's this idea that Europeans really like strong framing and a solid round, and Americans really like evidence-based, and so on and so forth. So I think this idea of judges having a preference is generally just not a particularly useful one if you don't know who's judging you, if you don't know where they're from, if you don't know who they are. So I think to some extent, obviously you want to try and do scouting, right? If you have friends who know the judges and who know their preferences, then finding out what that judge likes is probably in your interest, and adjusting your speech to what that judge likes is probably in your best interest. But I wouldn't put that much effort in it, because the reality of the matter is that, and I think Umar put it really well, if you're giving good speeches and they're persuasive and they abide by the rules of BP and you're doing all the things you're supposed to do, then you're going to rake in the points across 9 rounds. And I think this is the really, really important takeaway, especially for this point. There's a very non-zero chance that a judge will rob you. There's a very high possibility that more than one judge will rob you, or if they don't, that you will feel robbed by them at the very least. But personal experience, my feelings are truth to me, so there's that. But there's a very distinct chance, and I've noticed that a lot of people tend to get hung up on, oh, that judge hated me, or oh, that judge judged me unfairly, or anything like that. And it's frankly not helpful. It's not helpful to you. It's not helpful to them. It's not helpful to anyone. And if you start letting yourself get dragged into this kind of, I guess, spiral of doom and gloom that, oh, I lost this round, therefore I'm now in a worse position, therefore I now will get worse judging, therefore I won't break, that kind of thinking can be really, really destructive, and actually probably ends up making you speak worse than you would if you just accepted that Worlds is a marathon, not a sprint. It's not about winning every single round. It's ultimately about getting, depending on which break you're obviously aiming for, but assuming you're if you're an open speaker, then aiming for 2 points a round. If you're an ESL speaker, aiming for around the -2, -1 area. And if you're an EFL speaker, aiming for the -2, -3 area, right? So keeping in mind that and remember, it's not about winning every single round. It's about, taking as many points as you can. So if you notice that the judge seems to really vibe with a personal style and you just can't deal with it, try to take as many points as you can. Still do the best you can. And worst case, say, screw it, next round will go better. And that's all you can really do in that moment. And just don't allow it to let you to drag you down. Because I think this idea of the older judges prefer this, and now I have to adjust for them, or I just don't think it's going to help you if you spend half your prep on trying to think of ways to completely fundamentally change how you're speaking in a way that you're not comfortable with, instead of doing effective things like think of your strategy, think of rebuttal, you know, do things that BP actually requires you to do. And so if you can't adjust, that's fine. The other teams also probably won't. They're also your peers. They're not, you know, machines or gods or anything like that. You're just literally facing off against people just like you, who are just as stressed, who are just as nervous. And I think thinking about it that way can probably help you be more relaxed, more calm, and overall do better at Worlds.
Yep, amazing. I think the summary of all of that really is scout a bit if you can, but don't fundamentally like change everything that it is about your style, and certainly don't dwell on it. It's the long haul that you've got to focus on. One judge in one round, probably not the be all and end all. Amazing. Well, with that in mind, I wanna end on, I guess, like a slightly lighter, more fun kind of question, because I fundamentally hope people are getting excited for Madrid World. Kind of just a fun question of, I guess you've both, you know, attended a few different Worlds. Do you have a favorite one? And do you have like, is there like a core memory or like a fun memory from either? I would note that I really have again, showing my age, I have such a fondness of Berlin Worlds, probably because it was the one I did the best at. But it was really funny because a lot of people were like trashing on the food being very bland. And as like a basic white girl, I like love the food so much. And it was like one of the first times I've gone to a tournament and just like being able to fully eat all the food, because it was like mashed potatoes and like stuff like that. And everyone was complaining, but I was in heaven. It was like white girl heaven, you know? So Yossi, do you, anything that sticks out for you?
So, I mean, there's obviously always going to be the spectacle, and especially like, I know it's a rare experience. Only 12 teams are going to experience walking up the stage for the finals, but obviously with getting to pick your song and all that, that was very special. But I think a much more like generally and broadly applicable for everyone experience that I think is particularly fun, it won't be fun in the moment, but it will be fun in hindsight, is the shared suffering of anything that goes wrong. Now, of course, nothing will go wrong at Madrid. Don't worry, Jess. I'm sure it'll just go fine. But my first Worlds was Dutch Worlds. And at Dutch Worlds, for those of you who don't know, it was insanely cold, as in, even for Europe, it was very, very cold. A lot of the accommodations were about a kilometer away from where the buses were going. And a lot of the buses would take, they only had a very limited number of buses which had to go back and forth, meaning that often even once you arrived, you still had to wait in the cold for quite some time. And I remembered distinctly at the time, we had a lot of like bonding around that shared suffering of just standing at the cold in the dark in the Netherlands. And in hindsight, it's a very, you know, it's a very fond memory of like all those times I spent standing with my friends bitching about how terrible everything was. And I think, I don't think you'll feel that in the moment though, but in hindsight, it's a fun memory.
So you've just unlocked another like core memory for me, and I won't name the tournament, but there was one where we were waiting for buses to take us back to the hotel, and we couldn't make any travel ourselves because it was like over an hour away. So we were just stuck at the campus, and then when we finally got on the buses, everyone started singing, "Can you hear the people sing?" And it was just, it was so funny. And at the time it was dread, but it's so funny in hindsight. But of course, as you said, Madrid Worlds will run perfectly. Umar, what about you?
Yeah, so yeah, maybe unpopular opinion, but I obviously loved and hated 2019 Worlds. But like the one thing that like I can't ever get over when I look back at it is like the sheer scale of people that I was able to meet. And just like a lot of these people I'm still incredibly good friends with, given that I haven't seen some of them in years. Like the general, like the cultural exchange is something that is like, it cannot be overstated how beautiful of a moment it is. I remember the off day in 2019 Cape Town was a bunch of us just went to the beach, and it was phenomenal. It was by far, like, again, terrible beach in Cape Town, but like you know, even the cold water couldn't kill the vibes that day. And so, you know, those people that I met, like, again, I think I've traveled the world and I've visited a number of them since, and it's a really good opportunity for like, I don't know, like sort of triggering a massive amount of growth in me personally, just in terms of like, the world is way bigger than I thought it was, even as a university student, and people aren't maybe as different as I thought they were from me. And I think that was like, it gave me a lot of personal catharsis because, coming from the African circuit, there was definitely a lot of assumptions I held about global debating. And I think a number of them were reset at that point. And also just, I think maybe the one thing that I would also stress, should have said this first, that like Worlds is a lot of the times just thinking about how comfortable you feel doing certain things and making sure that you're able to set those boundaries. And so as long as you're able to do that and maybe like bring some lozenges, because your throat will probably die, you're probably gonna have a good time. Again, if you give yourself the space to.
Amazing. Well, I think that's a lovely note to end on. So I will say thank you very much for your insights and your time again today. And I'm sure they'll be very useful for people preparing for Worlds. So thank you.
Welcome everyone to today's panel discussion. My name is Macharia and I'm joined by two amazing debaters. I have Bella Robinson and I have Ameera, Natasha Moore. So we will be discussing a few things about how to prepare for WUDC, and I'm really, really excited for this conversation. All right. So first question, I wanted to pose this one to Ameera, is how do you differentiate online worlds and physical worlds? Like, what are the major differences you've noticed, considering that you've done both of them? How does somebody who has only done online debating adjust to worlds? What should they expect? And what are the major differences?
Okay, so I think that I'm going to start with explaining what are the differences and then how can teams sort of prepare for that, or how can judges prepare for that. So I think the major differences is, firstly, I think it's a lie when people say that debating is not a physical activity. I think the round itself may not be as much of a physical activity, but I do think major competitions can be physically exhausting. So what do I mean by that? Things that we would never imagine matter actually do end up mattering at these big scale competitions. For example, getting lost on your way to your room, or like figuring 10 minutes away on a hill in like a freezing temperature. Like all of these things do affect the mental state that you end up in, and that kind of makes your prep suck. So I do think that these are things that one needs to be prepared for. And I think the way of going about it is just kind of reminding yourself to not grow too complacent or comfortable with the idea of prepping in your own room and being behind the screen where you can control just about almost everything other than the actual debate. So I wish teams to, in preparation for that, do go for more physical Worlds tournaments, meet up with your teammates, even if your teammates are, in the same city, and then you think to yourself, what's the harm in us just doing it online? It's in that way. I do think that you need to push yourself, especially if as a team you guys are in the same city. I do think you need to take full advantage of being able to meet up physically. Obviously, if speakers are not in the same city, then there's only so much you can do, and I understand that. But I do think that trying to get to a point where you do cases, taking into account all of these physical things, should be something that teams take into consideration. I will say the second thing also of how it's different is just the general feel of being able to present your speech in a huge hall or a huge room filled with audiences, right? Because I think that when we're debating online, it's so easy for us to either just focus on Zoom, or half of the time, like, even look at the screen, right? Put a water bottle next to your screen and pretend like you're looking at the screen. And then that kind of letting you get over the intimidation that there's a lot of people watching your speech. That will end up mattering in physical tournaments. There will be audiences when you get into break rounds. And fact of the matter is, you know, as much as audiences try to not show their expression, there will be expressions shown. So you need to have that mental strength and discipline. I will say discipline more than strength, to not be affected by those kinds of expressions. Lastly, I will say that for me, I'm not entirely sure whether this is how it should be or how it shouldn't be moving forward. But one of the biggest things that I have noticed on online tournaments is that ever since COVID started and online tournaments started, there has been a huge emphasis on like speakers who are not speaking not show any expression whatsoever when that particular debater is speaking, or switching off their cameras because that will help out with the internet connection. But as far as I remembered it pre-COVID, heckling was a thing. I'm not saying it should be. I'm saying that it happened, right? And you don't want to be that debater that gets affected by the heckling of your teammate, especially when, sorry, not your teammate, your opponents, especially when they're physically present. You don't want to constantly pause your speech to be like, stop heckling, stop heckling. At one point, you just need to, go through the speech and have that discipline. So again, this is why I do think that the preparation of going to physical pre-Worlds tournaments and practicing with your club, with your teammate in person is something that can definitely make a huge difference preparing for Worlds later on.
All right, thank you so much, Ameera. We'll now move the question to Bella. So Bella, do you have any more differences you want to share?
Yeah, that was a really great answer. I suppose what I would add is, I guess that the main point, which is that you don't have control over your things in your own environment in the same way that you do when you're debating, at home or maybe like at your university. So in terms of like practical tips, make sure you like overpack your bag in the morning. Make sure you have like 10 spare pens, because you can't just like go and grab one, out of your pen container. Make sure you have lots of snacks gone and bought beforehand. One of the major things for me really is not having the same sorts of foods and comfort snacks available to me in my country as when I'm overseas, especially if you're going to a country like that speaks a different language and you can't read the labels on the food. Like, make sure you take some time to actually like get some plain chips that you can eat when you're nervous, or like some bread or something that you can actually just fill your stomach with, especially if, again, you're too nervous to eat the like tournament prepared food or anything like that. So just making sure that you kind of set yourself up for success at the start of the day. And then the second thing I'd probably say is that there's a lot more social interaction and socializing, which is obviously a huge positive and also can be a bit of, a negative. I think in that regard, just make sure that you think purposefully about, do I want to be consuming alcohol, on this evening? Is that going to be beneficial for me? If I am I going to have, what time am I going to go to bed? Just making sure that you don't get so swept up in the excitement of suddenly being able to socialize with everyone that you kind of sabotage your debating for the next day. So just, think carefully how you're going to handle that element of the tournament that you might not necessarily think about before you go.
Thank you so much for your answers, and we really, really appreciate all your great insights on, how the differences or what the differences are. And we really, 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 I hope people are paying attention to this because those were really, really great tips. So we'll now move to the second question, and this one I'll pass it to Bella first. So, before like major competitions, people need to prep, and they do use different strategies to try and prep for these major competitions. Now, both of you have been very successful at WUDC. So I think one of the main questions people who've been doing online tournaments would be asking is, how do I prep now for the debate part of WUDC? How do you prepare? Do you go for majors comps? Do you just write 1,000 case files? What should people do in order to, give themselves the best chance to perform well at WUDC? So I'll pass this on to Bella first.
Yeah, I think probably the preparation for the actual debating itself wouldn't be too different from what you're doing online. I suppose you have less sort of reliance on your computer. So one of the things I would note is make sure that you have kind of worked through your communication style with your partner, especially in prep. Like, I think a lot of lost time in prep, which, diminishes your ability to make good arguments, is people just like not knowing how to verbally communicate with each other. Maybe one teammate has a habit of like ranting and over explaining their idea to the other person. The other person needs to know how to communicate that. Like, I've got the idea, you stop, let me, focus. That's obviously different when you're online. You can just type like the entire case out to your teammate, and they don't have to deal with the noise and the thinking and the writing. So definitely make sure you're doing lots of in-person debates, like Ameera said. but also just communicating about communicating. Like, ask your teammate, you know, what is the most helpful way for me to talk to you during prep? Do you need periods of silence? Do you want more ideas? You know, how should we structure this so that you have time to think and listen and all of that sort of stuff. The second thing is make sure you study current events. I guess this is just more of like a general worlds tip. I think the benefit of making a meta file is not actually having it to use it, but just the benefit of like studied up and kind of putting all of that stuff into your brain, and kind of being a bit more across things. And yeah, just make sure that you're debating regularly in the lead up to Worlds and getting feedback from a variety of people. So debating a variety of people and getting feedback from a variety of people so that you're getting out of your own circuits kind of bubble if possible. If you have connections to different circuits, I think utilize them and try to you know, get exposure to how different people debate, so you're not kind of thrown off when you get to your first debate and it's totally different. Everyone's debating totally different from how you do, and you don't get kind of spooked. So if there is sort of pre-worlds that you can afford to go to or have the ability to go to, that's a really good way to do it.
All right, thank you so much. We'll move the question to Ameera.
Yeah, sure. I think to add on to the extensive answer that Bella just gave is, I think also just, I know this sounds a bit weird, but like kind of stalk the Adj Core's social media profiles to see what kind of news they've been sharing, or like what kind of tournaments they've been going to and what kind of motions they've been setting, because I think that gives you an idea of what kind of topic areas are they. I'm not saying they will definitely set it, you know, it's a good hint for you to work off of something, to see, even if it's not the specific topic area that they are interested in to set topics in. It could just be more like a broad thing, you know, maybe they're not necessarily into movies and pop culture, but you know that they're into like media and the sort of perception that media has in shaping society, you know, stuff like that. I think would be a good way for you to figure out like the strategy of what kind of topics to prepare for on top of general issues. I will say, you know, I mean, this is something that people should be doing with online debates as well. But I think it becomes so much more helpful in physical tournaments just because, again, with the added variables of like your room being fun, all of this is prepping cases, just getting to the groove of thinking very fast. So coming up with those issues, whether from the news or whether from motions that you've seen the World's Adj Core set previously, and then prep with your teammate. If you've done it before, do it again. Like do 15 minutes discipline, 15 minutes government. Okay, let's see how many things we can churn out. Okay, 15 minutes opposition. Let's see how many things we can churn out. Write it down, and then kind of keep those papers. I'm a huge fan of keeping things organized so that you can refer to them back later on. I have found my case files to be far more beneficial to me in comparison to my meta files. And just because I think that this is also where you need to kind of know yourself, know your strengths, and also know the strengths of your teammates, and then kind of play off of that, which is for some people, they can remember facts a lot, but they have a hard time remembering what was the extensive nuance justifications that they had in their cases prior to this. And then some people are the opposite. I personally found remembering facts to be a lot easier in comparison to remembering the small nuances. And sometimes I just need to refer back to my notes that I had previously to kind of jog my memory. You don't need to be writing down word for word what exactly it is that you prepped, but just things that will spark back that memory, I think will make prep far more efficient. The second thing I will say also is to spend time with your teammate, bond with your teammate prior to the tournament. The reason why I say this is important is because I completely agree with Bella that I think communicating and having that safe space with your teammate will help make you feel more comfortable in exploring and talking about the ideas that you have, but that isn't going to come out of thin air. That comes out of you knowing your teammate and building a friendship and a bond with your teammate, and figuring out that if they do have some constructive feedback for you, that you don't take it personally as a form of criticism, or if they don't think that the argument that you are suggesting in prep is something that would win you the debate, that you won't take it personally because you already have that level of trust. So I do think it is important to spend time, get to know your teammate, because I can't imagine going through worlds, the physical worlds, where like you don't like your teammate. It's going to be really hard on top of all of the other stresses. So take the time to get to know your teammate.
I think one part on the same question is, how do you prepare as a judge? Because I think we've covered a lot on how speakers should prepare, your teammates, your prep comms, and all that. What should judges do? What's unique about the judge prep for a physical WUDC?
Sure, Bella, do you want to go first?
You go ahead.
Okay. I think that for judges, I will say that first, so much like with debaters going for tournaments and practicing that physical style of debating, I do think judges should also make it a habit of attending these pre-Worlds tournaments that are accessible to them, and you know, going and judging physically. The reason why I say this is also because those things that I said initially, like the new variables that are now presented, even things like the temperature of the room that you never would have thought would matter, do end up mattering when you're judging. So for example, hot, humid areas can make judging sleepy, right? And you don't want to fall into that trap. So getting used to the different climate of being outside of your comfort zone, that's not just your bedroom, I think would make you know, your body get used to listening to people, listening to long speeches in various kinds of styles without, you know, zoning out. Secondly is also the practice of, you know, listening to a debate. And I think practicing your oral adjudication, I think, is a thing, right? Practicing coming up with an adjudication and figuring out what your scores are, I will say in less than 15 minutes. The reason why I say less than 15 minutes is because you practicing it on your own doesn't take into account the kind of panel discussion you would need to have later on at the tournament. So I would say try to limit it to like 10 minutes, maybe, of just like thinking who won the debate, how to come up with the scores, and then from there, practice how you would give an oral adjudication as clearly as possible. Because again, with oral adjudication, much like debate speeches, I do think practice makes perfect. You know, the more conviction you have, the more clarity, the more organization. I think these are things that you can get better with practice. And these are things that you don't just practice at physical tournaments, but also something that you can practice on your own by watching pre-recorded debates. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Bella, would you like to add anything to that on the judge prep?
Well, I haven't actually judged at Worlds yet, so I don't have any personal experience, but all of that sounds very sensible coming from Ameera.
All right. Thank you so much. Okay. The next question, I think we'll start with Bella, is sometimes WUDC can be very stressful, or at least I'm told. I've never been to a physical WUDC, that it does get very stressful sometimes. Either the rounds are not going well, or something happened at socials, or just different things could make you just extremely stressed. And so one of the questions we got was, how do you manage stress levels at WUDC, or how do you avoid stressful situations at WUDC? What tips do you have for people who just want to have a peaceful, stress-free world, you know, without any drama or just any spikes in their stress levels? I know it's difficult and almost impossible, but if there's a rubric, or if there's a way we can be able to just, you know, avoid stress, what would it be? I'll start with Bella, then we'll go to Ameera.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it is probably impossible to have a stress-free world unless you're just like in the country being a tourist and it's happening in the same place as you. But other than that, I think I have a couple of tips. So I think firstly, trying not to overthink the whole tournament by being like, oh, in the last debate, you know, we're on 5 points and we need X amount of points to break, but our speaks might be high. And like overthinking the grand scale of the tournament can be really distracting, and it doesn't do anything. Like the only thing that will help you break is doing good in the debate at that moment. So that's what you should be focusing on, right? Like think about the next debate that's coming up, do it well, and once it's happened, there's no point ruminating over it. It's happened. You can't change anything that happened, apart from, you know, you obviously want to reflect with your debate partner about what went well and what didn't, if that's something that's helpful for you. But don't stress about that one debate that went badly for the entire tournament. Just have an ethos of like one debate at a time and leaving the next one, you know, leave it in the past once you've done it. Second thing is, I think it's really helpful. I mean, obviously people have different preferences for whether they want to, you know, go away with their teammate and have a debrief. But I think one of the highlights for Worlds for me was actually chatting socially with the other 3 teams directly after the debate. And I think that's something that is completely lost from online Worlds, and maybe people who haven't gone to in-person tournaments don't really realize that that's part of the culture. So it would be really good to make sure that that does happen at this Worlds. I think the reason it's important for stress is that firstly, those people stop being your enemies and your rivals and start being your friends, right? So you can kind of compartmentalize the debate and say, that's a game, that's an activity we just did. And now let's interact with each other as humans and have a nice friendly conversation. And, there's a whole lot of amazing people from all over the world that you can talk to at Worlds. And it's really good to use that opportunity, to make conversation that you just debated together. Then you can actually go, chat to them later at socials, so it's not as awkward because you've kind of chatted to them before. So I think that's a nice way to kind of reduce stress. The third thing is understanding how your teammate deals with stress is really important. So if you are responding to their stress in a way that makes their stress worse, they're going to project their stress back onto you, and you're just going to get into this horrible cycle where you just destroy each other's emotions. So I think knowing, does your teammate respond positively to optimism and being really positive about what has happened, or do they find that really grating and annoying and they prefer that you would just rant about what happened, get it all out of your system in 10 minutes and then move on. So knowing how they respond to stress is the extra step of making sure that it doesn't kind of bounce back on you. And focusing your efforts on taking care of your teammate and looking after someone else can actually distract you from how stressed you're feeling, and can be a good way to just make sure that you are both having a good time. And then obviously just the basics, make sure you drink water, make sure you sleep enough the night before, make sure you eat food, remove yourself from the situation. Like Ameera said at the beginning, if people are talking about stressful topics that you don't really want to relitigate, and yeah, just take care of yourself, think about what you need, and make sure you don't beat yourself up over things that happen, which inevitably will happen throughout the tournament. You can't win every single debate. So at some point, there's going to be some emotional tribulation, and just, head high and keep dealing with it.
All right, thank you so much. Those were great tips. We'll now move the question to Ameera. How do you manage stress?
Sure. So I think that for me, I noticed that my style of managing stress changed when I was a debater versus when I was judging. So I think the first thing to say here is people will have different ways of managing their stress, right? Don't think that because we all love debating, we all worked hard to come to this competition, that we must all have the same ways of handling it. And if anybody doesn't conform to this, it must mean they don't take debate seriously. That's not true at all. Right, so that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, know yourself and know your teammates. So much like what Bella said, which is, understanding how your teammate manages stress, which is going back to the whole bonding with your teammate, getting to know your teammate in the lead up to Worlds, and also getting to know yourself and how you manage stress in the lead up to Worlds as well, because that could be an indicator of how you would eventually manage stress later on once you are at the Worlds Championship, right? So for example, for me, when I was debating in between rounds, I hated talking about debating. So I just wanted to check out, and I gave 0 flying Fs. I brought a neck pillow and slept in between rounds and listened to music, because for me, that was my way of zoning out and not listening to people relitigate the debate that happened. I mean, immediately after the debate, I will have my chat with my teammate being like, okay, let's get this out of the way. What did we do wrong? What did we agree with the judge? How can we do better? Okay, just practical. Okay, anything else? No? Cool. You go do your thing. I'm going to be in the corner sleeping, listening to my music. And then once the debate is going to start again later on, then you check back in, which changed in comparison to when I was judging. When I was judging, I think just because I feel like I had more room to be a little bit more playful in comparison to when I was debating, where it was constantly it felt like a fight for life every round. I think when I was judging in between rounds, I would feel my way of managing stress was to socialize a lot more, to get to know people, to talk about what were their thoughts about the debate. And I think because I felt like that was a good way of me understanding how to view debates differently in comparison to the way that I viewed it, and that could help me judge future rounds later on. But as a debater, sometimes when you're trying to prep, you're trying to figure out how to come up with a winning case, you're trying to come up with a winning case that suits your style and your teammates, and then on top of that, trying to also incorporate every other feedback that everybody else has on top of the feedback that the judges have. It's a lot. You're not going to be able to incorporate all of it by the next round. So I think that's why sometimes it's important for you to draw boundaries in saying that, okay, I think I've accepted enough feedback that for right now, just before the next round, insofar as I can absorb, anything beyond this, I'm going to be overwhelmed. It is okay for you to draw those boundaries. And then later on in the second round, take different feedback and then take time off. And then third round, take different feedback and then take time off. So I think creating those boundaries would help. So yeah, don't be ashamed of your way of de-stressing. If you want to sleep, go sleep. If you want to talk to people, go talk to people, which is why I think that if you're the type that doesn't really want to exude too much energy in between rounds by also socializing and finishing your battery that way, I think a good way to compensate and making sure that you still socialize to some degree is what Bella said, is while you're waiting for the results and immediately after the debate, when all of the teams are standing outside awkwardly, take full advantage of that time to get to know these different people from different countries that you otherwise would not have the privilege to meet. I think that's a really important part of Worlds that I honestly truly miss, that has been missing from the online tournaments. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, both of you, for your great insights on the stress management. I'm very sure a lot of people have never been to a physical Worlds and they will need to, manage stress. So thank you for all the tips. I do hope they implement the different strategies you've shared. So the last question as we conclude this panel discussion. So WUDC is not just stressful. Again, I'm told it's very fun. So I wanted to know, like, what is the funnest, or what would you say is the most fun activity you do at Worlds? And what do you remember, like, from your memory of Worlds being maybe your favorite moment at WUDC, the one you can say, this moment I was truly happy and having fun? So what's the most fun activity you remember from WUDC? And if you have any comments for people who are wondering, how do I have fun at Worlds? Despite all the stress, debating, and all the things we've shared, how do I make sure that I have a good time? So I know it's a very broad question, but I think simplifying it, it's, what do you remember being your most fun activity? What activities, other than the one you remember having the most fun with, are also fun? And what advice do you have for someone who just is looking for ways to have fun at WUDC and also just have a good time? So Ameera, we'll start with you on this one.
Sure. I think mine, it's pretty cliche. It's like break night, just because my best memory of Worlds, it's like I'm this 20-something-year-old person from this country, and I'm flown in to debate. And then smack at New Year's, I'm surrounded by other middle 20, early 20-year-olds from all sorts of different cultures. And for once, we don't have to talk about debate. Like, we can just socialize, enjoy the night, do a countdown. I cannot tell you how those have literally created some of the core memories I've had in life. Not many people get to say that for, like a big annual thing, you go and hang out with your friends from your home country in a different country, but also from, hang out with your friends who do come from these other countries. So I will say, go out, enjoy the night, socialize. If you don't, you're going to regret it. You don't have to drink, okay? That being an important thing. You don't have to drink. There are so many pockets of groups all around break night. Some are having room parties where they're playing wholesome games, right? Like no drinking involved. And then there will be bigger rooms where there is drinking involved. There's all sorts of different groups that you can find, that's better suited for you. But all I'm saying is take full advantage of this, because I feel like not many people get the opportunity to say that they have this big annual celebration where they're young, they're youthful, they're energetic, they've got so much passion. They've all been congregated in the same place, all for the love of one activity. Like that's not something that you get often. So seize the moment. I will say that that's super, super important. The second thing is the free day, explore the city. I will say that the sucky part about 3 days before is just that it's always on by right, because break night is 31st of December and free day being on the 1st of January, a lot of things are closed on New Year's, right? But it doesn't mean you have to go in and enter the shops. You could just enjoy sightseeing of this country that, again, some people may have the opportunity even without Worlds, but many of us don't. So take full advantage of that. I will say one of the biggest takeaways and one of the greatest lessons I've learned from debating is actually not what happens in the debate room. It's actually what's happened outside of the debate room, which is getting to know different cultures and different people and different backgrounds. And you realize how that kind of thing teaches you to become a much more self-aware and worldly person and a much more considerate person that hopefully can do a lot of good for society. So yeah, those two things. Don't waste this opportunity. Go for it.
All right. Thank you so much. Bella, do you have any additional tips for people who want to have fun?
Yeah, well, that was a great answer from Vera, and I definitely echo it. Yeah, break night is often the most fun, but also the most emotionally intense because there's a lot of, disappointed expectations from some people. So sometimes some of the other socials are a lot of fun as well, especially like countries night. I really love. You get to eat all the like different food and all the different drinks, and kind of gives you an excuse to kind of chat to people at the stalls in a way that's slightly less awkward. Yeah, I mean, go make sure you even just walk around slightly outside of where you're staying. Do the best that you can to kind of like see the city and enjoy things and make the most of the socials. And really, I think really try to attend as many socials as you can, keeping in mind your own exhaustion levels and energy and social battery and all of that sort of stuff. But I think it's like you're only there for so much amount of time. You may as well try and make the most of it. Don't beat yourself up if you're not a super social person and you struggle like talking to people. It's okay to just hang out with your friends and have an amazing Worlds, like really solidifying bonds with people from your circuit or your country or your university. Like that's totally valid as well. You don't have to make like new BFFs from like every single continent around the world. Just have fun. Make sure that you don't talk about debating. Don't talk about the rounds like at the socials. Like they're two different experiences. Keep them separate. And yeah, I think Ameera kind of basically said everything I was going to say. So just a +1 on that.
All right. What's your most memorable moment, Bella? Like which moment can you say was the peak of your enjoyment at Worlds?
I really loved the Cape Town break night on the cricket field. Like it was just so strange, like just hay bales just to sit on, and everyone's just running around in the dark with yucca cups overflowing and chewing on all the lemons, and it's just like just across the road from the university where we're staying, and you kind of stumble back across and just kind of hearing everyone's differing perceptions and tales of what ensued that night is very amusing.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate you taking your time to join us for this panel discussion. And I'm very, very, very excited for Worlds. And I do hope the people who watch this video do get a few tips and they will learn a few things from you, who are some of the best debaters around, on how to, manage stress, have fun, and also prepare for WUDC. So thank you so much. And we appreciate your time and effort. And that brings us to the end of this panel discussion. Hopefully we'll join them for a few more panel discussions later. All right. Thank you.